Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumúd. All about humanity, so this right here for everyone. Uplift, amplify, empower everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumúd.
On today's episode of the Sumúd Podcast, we uplift, empower, and amplify Dr. Zachary Foster, a historian of Palestine. Dr. Foster earned his PhD in Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. His dissertation is entitled The Invention of Palestine. He founded Palestine Nexus, a go-to source for understanding Palestine. He also oversees the newsletter Palestine in Your Inbox, which covers the history, politics, and culture of Palestine. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. Follow us on Instagram, X, and Threads with the handle @SumúdPod, or Facebook and LinkedIn @Sumúd Podcast. You can't follow us on TikTok because they banned us for saying Free Palestine. So too bad for TikTok. Zach, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
So first things first, I actually took your course, the Palestine-Israel 101 course. I went through the whole thing over the past week. Phenomenal content. Loved it. How much time did that take to put that together?
20 some years or so. I mean, if you think about all the research, all the reading, all the work that went into it, it really goes back to the time I first took interest in Palestine, which I guess dates back 20 some odd years. But yeah, just sort of like putting the slides together and just thinking through the talking points, and that took 4, 5, 6 months or so.
Yeah, no, it was really good content, really informative. I do recommend everybody to check it out. Even before they listen to this podcast, it's so informative, the way you sort of break down the information. And I know a lot about Palestine, obviously being Palestinian, but with great humility, I didn't know as much as you shared. So I really do appreciate you putting that together. I do have a request, though. Maybe we could talk about it offline. Could we create a version of it for the workforce? A lot of DE&I councils, diversity, equity, inclusion councils, or ERGs, employee resource groups, who are maybe thinking about learning about Palestine. Because right now you're not allowed to say Palestine in the workplace, but I think we're going to get there pretty soon, I hope. Would you consider maybe doing something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. The goal of the course is to reach a broader audience, is to reach folks who don't have expertise, don't have background in Palestine. So I think that's exactly the kind of a person or persons we would be interested in reaching.
Okay, great. So we'll figure out how to make it more workforce friendly or something to that extent, if you're good with it. I did read your dissertation, but in all honesty, I only read half of it because half of it was burned. Would you like to talk about why you burned half of your dissertation?
That's a good question. I think I created a video a couple years back where I think the title of the video is something to the effect of why I burned my PhD dissertation or something like that. And at the time, I think the trigger for that video was I had applied for a grant from the National Institute for Humanities, which is a U.S. federal government institute that funds scholars and PhDs to reach a broader audience. I think it's called the Public Scholars Award, if I'm not wrong. And the goal of that award is to help researchers, professors turn their academic research into works that are more consumable, more digestible for broader audiences, non-experts. I applied for that award, for that grant, and But my proposal was based on my dissertation research. I said, look, I want to turn my dissertation into a book for broader audiences. They said, oh, well, you can't do that because there's no possible world in which any dissertation ever written by anyone in any PhD program could ever possibly be rewritten in such a way that it could appeal to a broader audience. And that was the response. And I think this, generally speaking, it is the problem with so many PhD dissertations is that they're covering such niche topics. They're such the language is impenetrable. It's arcane. And it's just so difficult to read. And so there's so many problems with PhD dissertations, and I wanted to highlight some of those problems. And I use that kind of catchy title and that sort of hook of burning my PhD dissertation as a way to expose some of these problems with the entire PhD dissertation writing process.
Yeah, totally agree with you. So my dissertation focused on workplace religious discrimination against Muslim women who wear the headscarf or the hijab. And it was a nightmare converting it into a book. You're absolutely right. I ended up having to expand it about all religions in the workplace, which is great because of the feedback that I received from different groups and different religions, but absolutely very hard. But you also burned your diploma too, I think, right?
That's right. I think I burned the diploma first. I think that was the first in the series of videos where I was lighting stuff on fire. Not because I'm a pyromaniac, or maybe not just because I'm a pyromaniac, but also because, look, there are also many problems with elite universities like Princeton, right? They don't increase, they increase their freshman seat size like 1 seat per year. They, they charge inordinate amounts of money for tuition. They a student who graduates excuse me, a student who comes from the top, I believe it's the top 1%. If their parents are a $500,000 a year income earning household, they're 20 times more likely to get into a Princeton or a Harvard or a Yale than a student from the bottom 20%. So there's all these problems, and I wanted to highlight again some of those problems with higher education more generally, especially elite higher education, which is a luxury brand. It's not a public good, and yet the endowment is, if you donate money to Princeton University, that's tax deductible. That's a tax deductible donation. When Meg Whitman donated $30 million to Princeton, actually, $10 million of those dollars was picked up by taxpayers who are funding education for the top 1%. It doesn't make sense. And I wanted to highlight some of those problems in that video.
And you got your master's from Georgetown, correct?
That's right.
So please don't, I work at Georgetown. I'm an adjunct there. So please don't burn your diploma there. I don't want to get in trouble or anything like that, if that's okay.
Well, fun fact, I almost didn't get that diploma. There was an attempt by my then advisor to basically sabotage my prospects of graduating. Not worth necessarily getting into now, but I almost didn't get that degree.
Was it because of Palestine? Was it related to it? Or is it something completely different?
I mean, only tangentially. It's like I said, it's not worth getting into. But look, it's the problem with many academic departments is that professors have basically absolute control over students. If a professor wants to sabotage a student and wants to prevent them from graduating, that is within their power, and there's not a whole lot the student can do about it. And that was that's basically what happened to me. In the end, it worked out, and I did get the degree. But again, there's many problems with academia. Professors having essentially absolute control over their students is one of them.
Yep. Great. And I can't remember where I read this, but did you visit the Khalidi library during the process of writing your dissertation? Because that experience was hilarious to me. How they basically said, no, it's not here, and you're like, but it is.
Yeah, that story dates to, was it 2014, I believe, when I was in Jerusalem doing research for my dissertation and wanted to access the Khalidi Library, which is a private library in the old city of Jerusalem owned by the Khalidi family. And I managed to get access to that library. Incidentally enough, I somehow managed to convince the custodians of the library that I was some distant relative of the Khalidi family. I don't know how I managed to convince them of that, but basically that got me access to the library, but it didn't get me access to everything in the library. And when I asked to view the private papers of, I believe it was Ruhi al-Khalidi, whose private papers are housed in the Old City of Jerusalem library, right? In that library, which I know because Rashid Khalidi, a member of the Khalidi family, Arab studies professor at Columbia, outspoken Palestinian activist, one of the perhaps one of the most famous Palestinian scholars today, he cites many documents from that library in his book. And when I was told, these documents don't exist, or they're not in the library, they're in the Beiruti branch of the library, which, by the way, doesn't exist. I said, well, that's interesting. And I flip open my copy of Rashid Khalidi's book, which is, of course, in my backpack, which I brought so that I could, because he indicates, the document numbers and so on and so forth. At that point, I was like basically unceremoniously uninvited back to the to the library in the archive, which I think is, by the way, not especially unique. I mean, I think this is the case with libraries and archives around the Middle East. They don't like, for whatever reason, they are very skeptical of historians and And so it's quite common to be denied access to libraries and archives in the Middle East, including the Khalidi Library. I just read a headline from earlier in the week that there's essentially a settler takeover happening right now. At one of the library has multiple buildings. There's multiple facilities, and where they house the books, where you have a reading room, and so on. And I believe there's extremist settlers trying to take over one of the buildings. Look, this is not something that is affecting just the Khalidi family. It's affecting all Palestinian families in the Old City, in the neighborhood surrounding the Old City, in Area C of the West Bank. Basically all around historic Palestine. Of course, within Israel itself, in the Naqab, where you have Palestinian Bedouin facing evictions all the time. So this is quite a common occurrence, and now it's also affecting the Khalidi family. I don't know the details of exactly what happened or what the circumstances are right now, but I think the Khalidi family has bigger issues than me to worry about.
Fair enough. No, fair enough. And that's unfortunate. Hopefully we can preserve that and mitigate the impact there. So you grew up in a Zionist household. You grew up in Michigan. You grew up very pro-Israel, pro-Zionist. At some point, something flipped or clicked, and you said, "Wait a minute, maybe not so fast." Can you walk me through that a little bit?
Yeah, so it's a process. Someone who grows up in my environment doesn't overnight go from Zionist to not non-Zionist or anti-Zionist. That's something that takes many, many years. In my case, over a decade, I would say. The first, I would say, thing that had an impact on me was spending time in Jerusalem as an undergraduate student, as a study abroad student, and first being exposed to Palestinian culture, Palestinian, Arabic. I just was so ignorant. I just had no idea, really. I mean, you have to realize someone who grows up in the Zionist environment that I grew up in the 90s and early 2000s is just totally unaware. I mean, about anything and everything Palestine related. So for me, that was just an eye opening, and got interested in kind of learning Arabic and just Palestinian culture. And that was sort of the first, I would say, the first domino to fall. The second was a program I went on in the Balkans, half Jewish, half Palestinian, where we had dialogues and talked about the issues of dividing the Jews and the Palestinians. I would say the most significant of which was the fact that us Jews, American Jews, can move to Israel tomorrow, get an Israeli passport, and settle in the country. Whereas the Palestinian Americans, whose parents and grandparents are from Palestine and were violently ethnically cleansed from Palestine because they were Palestinian, they don't have a right to move to Israel, Palestine. And that just made no sense to me. So that was an important domino to fall. And then I, started learning the history and reading the history. And I would say, standing on one foot, the deeper you study the history of Zionism, the more anti-Zionist you become. Because you learn from the 1880s to the 1940s, every single major Zionist leader, starting from Theodor Herzl, going on down to Arthur Rupin and Ze'ev Jabotinsky and Israel Zangwill, and Joseph Weitz and Ze'ev Jabotinsky, they were all pro-ethnic cleansing. I mean, at the time it was called transfer, but they were all pro-transfer. They had hoped the Arabs would voluntarily accept transfer, but most of them were not so naive to believe that. Most of them were aware and realized that no, the Arabs had no intention of abandoning their sources of livelihood, their means of livelihood, and just packing up and moving to the desert. No, they were planning on staying put. And so there was really only one option, which was, if you want to establish a Jewish state in a country that's overwhelmingly non-Jewish, and the natives are not willing to leave, they're not going to accept voluntary transfer. Well, what options do you have left? Forcible transfer, which is exactly what the Zionists ended up doing in 1948 and have been doing more or less continuously since. And I think that's just the beginning. That's the starting point to coming to the realization that Zionism was a disastrous idea and had disastrous consequences for Palestinians. And then you go and you visit Masaf al-Yatta, and you visit Khan al-Ahmar, and you visit Hamsa, and you visit Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah and the Old City of Jerusalem. You visit the Naqab, and you see Zionism in real time. You see the ethnic cleansing happening in real time, and that only strengthens your resolve and strengthens your commitment to a state that doesn't treat Jews any differently than it treats Muslims, any differently than it treats Christians.
No, thank you for that. And just to go back to your dissertation, were you bullied at all during that process? Was there any sabotage of putting your dissertation together or the research that you were doing? Did you get any pushback?
Well, I actually did get some pushback, but it wasn't so much around Palestine per se, or any of the historical arguments I was making per se. It was more around the style, right? Because I took a more colloquial style. I have like fart jokes in my dissertation, right? There's things that don't really conform to what is traditionally thought of as a academic dissertation from the Princeton Near Eastern Studies department of all departments. So I got pushback on that for sure. But as far as the content of the dissertation goes, less so.
Yeah. And you have a healthy, I'm going to say healthy obsession with maps. And that's one of the reasons you started Palestine Nexus, correct? So when I watched and read about that, it made me, I don't know if you ever watched The West Wing. And there was a scene where President Bartlett, who's obviously the president in the show, was gifted a map of Palestine, and he wanted to put it outside the Oval Office, and all of his staff said, no, you can't do that. And he asked why not, and they said because it doesn't recognize Israel. And he said, well, Israel didn't exist at that point, and it was a whole thing. That's the first thing that came to my mind. I don't know if you've seen that before.
I have seen that clip. Yeah, I don't watch The West Wing, but that clip I've seen.
Okay, got it. And you were talking about Theodor Herzl. Just to go back to him for a second, Zionism or Christian Zionism actually started before him. Is that correct? Because that's one of the biggest things I took away from some of the course that I took of yours.
That's exactly right. So, you could say Zionism was a Christian phenomenon before it was a Jewish phenomenon. Already in the 1830s, you have not just individuals, but you already have, I would say, a movement of European Christians. They're messianists. They believe in eschatological fantasies about the end of the world and the return of Jesus Christ to planet Earth. And those eschatological fantasies involve Jews moving to the land of Palestine. That's going to bring about the second coming of Jesus Christ. And so this movement of Christians, you could say, already, I mean, it really goes back to 16th, 17th century, but it really doesn't pick up in earnest until, let's say, the 1830s, 40s, 50s, when you have not one, not two, but many, many dozens of Christian theologians writing about the Jewish return to Palestine. I mean, return to Palestine, as they put it. And there's even attempts to buy land in Palestine, Christian attempts, right? James Finn, the British consul in Jerusalem, he buys land in the Palestinian village of Artas, I believe in the 1850s, 1860s, to resettle Jews there. And then you have many other Christians supporting Zionism for other reasons already in the 1870s and 80s, really before there's much of a Zionist movement to speak of. For other reasons as well, I would say first and foremost was the belief that Jews moving to Palestine would provide European colonial powers a kind of an extension of their colonial footprint in the Middle East. A second reason was anti-Semitism. Well, these filthy, dirty Jews living in Europe, wouldn't it be great if they all left Europe? They're parasites, they're financiers, they're destroying Europe. So wouldn't it be great if they all moved to Palestine? That was another reason. So there were many reasons why Christians embraced Zionism in Europe in the 19th century. But yes, it did predate Jewish Zionism. Absolutely.
So as a Palestinian, I am told almost every day in DMs that you don't exist, you've never existed, Palestine never existed. Can you make me feel better about myself and my people and prove that I did exist, or we do exist?
Yeah, Palestinians don't exist. You didn't know that, Ed. Well, look, I mean, in some sense, they're not wrong, right? Like, all human identities, Palestinian, Israeli, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, they're just invented, right? You can't look into someone's DNA and figure out if they're Jewish or Palestinian or Muslim or Christian, right? There's no way. These are identities we all made up. So in that sense, I mean, actually, all these identities are invented. But of course, there's a specific reason why Zionists love telling you that Palestine is invented. And Palestinians aren't invented people, right? Because they're nationalists, they're Jewish nationalists. They believe that Jews have an exclusive right to the land of Israel. And so it's a problem for them that there were a people known as Palestinian calling this place Palestine. Right, it's a problem for their own national aspirations, because how can they then claim that this is an exclusively, Jewish land? that should be exclusively meant for Jews, when actually, it's Palestine, and there were Palestinians who are calling it Palestine and who are striving for a Palestinian national homeland. So it's just because of nationalism and Jewish nationalism and Zionism that this whole kind of propaganda around there's no such thing as a Palestinian came about in the first place, right? You don't hear anyone saying there's no such thing as a Syrian, there's no such thing as a Lebanese, there's no such thing as an Egyptian. Why specifically there's no such thing as a Palestinian, right? Well, it's because of Zionism.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I don't remember the guy's name. Who was the first person that used the word Philistine or identified uh, as Palestinian?
Well, so if we want to start, in the ancient world, or let's say in the pre-modern world, you have a guy, Ahmed ibn Muhammad al-Maqdisi, also known as Muqaddisi. He dies in 991, so we're talking more than 1,000 years ago. He calls himself Palestinian in a book he wrote called Ahsan al-Taqasim fi Ma'rifat al-Aqalim. It's basically this magnum opus. It's a geographical work published in the 10th century, and he relates a story of his travels to Persia, and he explains how he met this Persian guy he was chiseling in, and a Persian chiseler asked him, "Where are you from?" Or he said, like, where are you from? And he said, "I am Palestinian." So by the way, Palestinian identity existed 1,000 years ago, but then you do see, basically, you call it a 900-year kind of a gap where you don't really find very many people, if anyone, calling themselves Palestinian until the 19th century. Now, already in the mid to late 19th century, you have non-Palestinians using that word to describe the Arabic-speaking inhabitants of Palestine. So you have a German writer in 1886 use that word in German. You have a British writer using that term in 1870. You have American writers using it in the early 1890s. The first Palestinian to use that term in a work is 1898, and it's Khalil Bedas. The second and third would be Salim Kobain and Najib Nassar, who used that term in 1901 and in 1901, respectively. And then by the year 1914, you could say that the term is widespread. We published a paper, my colleague Emmanuel Beshka and I published a paper a couple of years ago documenting something like 120 usages of that term, either Philistini or its plural, Philistiniyin, Palestinian or Palestinians. We found that term 120 times in Arabic sources prior to 1914. So the term is already widespread in newspapers and journals and magazines and books in the last, call it, 2 decades before World War One. Throughout the Middle East.
To all you bullies out there, I do exist, just to be clear. You can't debate me anymore. Zach says so. And I do want to note, Zach, once again, a guest knows Arabic or speaks Arabic much better than I do. So thank you for that self-esteem hit there. The one thing that I did find fascinating in the course that I took of yours was that Theodore Herzl attempted to purchase Palestine for 20 million pounds, which is like $2 billion, I think. How crazy is that?
Well, yeah, he was of the belief that the way to settle Jews in Palestine was to achieve diplomatic recognition of Palestine from a great power, and or actually just buy Palestine from the Ottoman Empire itself. And so he arranges a meeting with Sultan Abdulhamid II himself in the late 1890s. I believe 1898 or 9 or so, and yeah, he meets with the Sultan and says, we'd like to buy Palestine, and he's laughed out of the room, right? The Sultan says, like, this is a holy land. This is the holy land. I'm obviously not going to sell it to you. All the great powers have been, trying to take over Palestine for decades. Obviously, I'm not going to sell it to you. But yeah, he's laughed out of the room. But yeah, he does attempt to buy it from the Sultan in the late 1890s, I believe.
And he attempted other approaches as well, other than purchasing, if I'm not mistaken, as well. So
yeah, that's right. He meets with the King of Italy. He meets with, I think, the German Kaiser. He obviously is very active in the British Empire. But no, all of his attempts fail to obtain diplomatic recognition for a Jewish state in Palestine. That wouldn't happen for another decade and a half after his death, when obviously the British Empire declares the Balfour Declaration in 1917. So that obviously happened, a decade and some after he died.
And can you give a quick overview? Because recently, as you know, Trump made a comment, "You bad Palestinian," and people mistakenly, I believe, unless you're the expert here, conflate Philistines with Palestinians. And of course, Philistine is essentially a derogatory term towards somebody, right? And now Palestine or Palestinian is a derogatory term, or they're using it as such. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's interesting. The word you Philistine or Philistine, I don't know the correct pronunciation
That's
actually. Yeah, it's a dirty word, right? I mean, if you think about, I don't know the etymological history of that, the usage of that word in the English language. That would be very interesting to study to try to trace the how that word became derogatory in English. But if I had to speculate, I would imagine that it, for the biblical Israelites were kind of the good guys in the Bible, right? I mean, obviously, it's a Jewish text, and the Israelites are themselves the Jews, so of course they're going to portray themselves as the protagonists. And then the Christians inherited the Bible, the Old Testament, as part of the Christian canon. And so, of course, and the Christians see themselves as kind of the newer, better, more perfected form of the Jews who fail to recognize Christ. And so and so it wouldn't surprise me if this is a sort of a kind of a relic of Christian kind of hostility towards or sort of embrace of the Israelites and rejection of the Israelites' enemies, the Philistines. But that's speculation. I don't actually know that history. Now, as far as the using the term Palestinian as an insult, well, that doesn't surprise me at all. There's never been a more anti-Palestinian president in U.S. history than Donald Trump. I mean, the guy. His ambassador to Israel was David Friedman, a guy who for decades and decades was not just supporting Israeli settlements, which are illegal under international law because it's illegal to transfer your civilian population into occupied territory, according to the 1948-49 Geneva Conventions. Not only was he himself supporting them, but he was funding them. He himself was basically the chief fundraiser for basically a settlement fund that donated money to Beit El, which is a settlement, a settlement now that is given rise to violent settlers, some of the most violent and extremist of all the Israeli settlers living in Beit El, just outside Ramallah. That's his choice for Israeli ambassador. He obviously chose his son-in-law Jared Kushner to lead the Middle East peace process. Jared Kushner's peace to prosperity plan, as it was known, essentially envisioned $50 billion in Gulf aid to the Palestinians in exchange for permanent Israeli apartheid. That was the deal. It was we'll get some Gulf money for you if you're willing to accept permanent political subjugation and Israeli apartheid forever. So that was his choice for basically Middle East peace envoy. And then you have Jason Greenblatt, his other Jared Kushner's, let's say, right hand man, who again was pro settlement. If you just read his tweets, these guys are all pro ethnic cleansing, pro settlement, pro apartheid. That was Donald Trump's kind of cabinet of village idiots in charge of U.S. policy on Israel Palestine for 4 years. So, I mean, does it surprise me that Donald Trump came out with some slur that using the word Palestinian as an insult? No, this is sort of par for the course for Donald Trump.
And he actually insulted us, comparing Biden to us. That's the way I took it. I took it the other way.
It's funny because people, some Palestinians, I think I posted on, I tweeted about this, and people were like, "Well, I take that as a compliment, right?" Like, so people took it different ways. But I think if you look at the meaning Donald Trump meant, right, his intended meaning was obviously as a slur, but yeah, other people interpret it different ways for sure.
Yeah, I made a joke on Twitter that Donald Trump was hallucinating and thought that Biden was DJ Khaled. And Biden thought he was DJ Khaled as well. So it was a little confusing for everybody.
Yeah, DJ Khaled, where's he been? Has he been posting? I don't know how much he's been posting lately.
Definitely not about Palestine. So would you consider Jared Kushner the modern day Theodore Herzl based on his appetite to buy people off, essentially?
It's an apt comparison, right? I mean, in a certain sense, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call him the Jared Kushner, or I wouldn't necessarily call him the Theodore Herzl, but I would try to think, who is like Jared Kushner. You have to realize, son of very wealthy donors to Harvard. That's how he got into Harvard. His most famous business deal was, I think he spent $1.8 billion on a piece of commercial real estate in basically like a few months before the great financial crisis of 2008. So he literally paid like peak value for a property that plummeted in value just literally a few months later. Terrible businessman, just like his father-in-law, believing that the solution to the problem in the Middle East is, money. If you just throw money at it, that will solve the problem. This has actually been a refrain for many Zionists over many decades, is the solution to the problem is money. The Palestinians, well, if only we just give them enough cash, well, that will solve the problem. That has never been a solution to dispossession and displacement and humiliation and ethnic cleansing. Never has it been the solution, and never will it be the solution. The solution to subjugation is equality, not money.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree with that. So I want to talk about Hamas in a little bit, because Hamas has been around since, apparently, according to some folks, since the 1900s, which clearly early 1900s rather, not true, right? But one question I wanted to ask you was Jordan's role in the, I'm going to say, theft of Palestinian land. Can you speak to that a little bit?
During which period are you thinking about right now?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So can you kind of give the historical context of the different points?
Yeah, so going all the way back, say, to the Peel Commission for the Peel Partition Plan, basically from 1937. I mean, that's really when we could really date, this Jordan's problematic role, let's call it, as it relates to the Palestinians. So the Peel Commission basically envisaged a partition of Palestine, and the Arab part of Palestine would go to Jordan. That's what the British decided in 1937, and so and then in 1948. During the 1948 war, the Jordanian monarchy, the Transjordanian monarchy, made essentially a secret agreement with the Zionist community in Palestine. Golda Meir actually snuck across the border in late 1947 and makes a secret agreement with Jordan that basically says, you don't attack us, we won't attack you. The Zionists said, you can take the Arab part of Palestine, basically the West Bank, but as long as we'll let you take that as long as you don't attack us. I mean, that's exactly what happened. So there's collusion already during the 1948 war, and there's been much has been written about it. This isn't really debated. This is more or less established as fact. And then shortly after the 1948 war, there's a sense of betrayal on the part of the Palestinians, who are now living under Jordanian-occupied West Bank, and because the Jordanian monarchy is perceived to have essentially usurped Palestinian land, taken over Palestinian land, denied Palestinians the right to self-determination. And so in 1950, you get a Palestinian who assassinates the King Abdullah, I believe, of Jordan, on the steps of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in 1950. And this leads the Jordanian monarchy to implement a total gag order on anything and everything Palestine in the 1950s and 60s. And so you get these anecdotes in the literature. I believe Dina Muttad, who is a professor at SOAS, if I'm not wrong, in the UK, publishes a memoir of her childhood growing up in Jordanian-controlled West Bank, Jordanian-occupied West Bank, I believe in Ramallah in the 1950s, where she says, the school teacher asked me, where are you from? And she said, I'm from Palestine. And the school teacher whips her with a stick and says, where are you from? She's like 11 years old at the time, and is probably not so clued into the political controversies surrounding Jordanian occupied Palestine. And he says, where are you from? And she says, Palestine, and he whips her again. And so this has been, and this is just the beginning, right? And then in 1970, you have infamously Black September, where for the previous 2 decades, you have Palestinian fighters, carrying out cross-border raids on Israel, and Israel's retaliating, and Jordan has sort of had enough of this, and so they go in September 1970. The Jordanian monarchy goes in and basically shells these refugee camps in Jordan and slaughters thousands and thousands of Palestinians and Jordanians in that very bloody month of September in 1970. And you could say even to this day, really, I mean, Palestinian freedom is suppressed in Jordan, right? You can't talk openly about being Palestinian. There's no census. You'll never know how many Palestinians are in Jordan, right? Because that would be a threat. That would be, a threat to the monarchy. They're constantly worried that the Palestinians will turn their demographic a majority into political power. And so there's been a constant suppression of anything and everything Palestinian, really, to this day.
And which king? I don't know the numbers. King Abdullah was assassinated in Jerusalem,
That's exactly right. Yeah, in 1950, I believe.
1950, and was he the first one to basically turn his back on Palestinians, or
Yeah,
is
you
that
could say.
yeah?
Yeah, you could say he was the first. But it's really been a consistent policy of the Jordanian monarchy. You could say really to the present day. To basically abandon the Palestinians. And look, it's happening even now, right? They're participating in this humanitarian theater, dropping aid by aircrafts to the Palestinians in Gaza, rather than actually trying to apply pressure on Israel to allow humanitarian aid in. Instead, they're essentially complicit in the blockade. So I mean, not complicit, but let's say like not really doing anything real to protest it. So yeah, they're you could say they're just like most of the rest of the Arab world, which is that they talk a big game, but they don't actually do anything in reality to prevent Israeli violence or yeah, prevent this genocidal war being waged on the Palestinians.
Right. So talk to me a little bit about Hamas, and I'd like you to educate our audience about Hamas because obviously there's a lot of misunderstanding about Hamas and where they started, how long they've been around. But do in a sense where a complete novice has no idea, just to kind of break down what Hamas is and what it's been.
To understand the rise of Hamas, you have to understand at first the Israeli occupation of Gaza and the West Bank, which began in 1967. Right, there was no Hamas before 1967. The organization is originally a charity organization, beginning, I believe it's founded by in 1973 by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who himself is a refugee who is violently ethnically cleansed from his home. I believe in Juba, if I'm not wrong, which isn't today. It's one of the 500 destroyed Palestinian villages, destroyed in 1948. So he winds up in Gaza, starts his charity organization in the 70s, which is like any other charity organization. They're funding schools and orphanages and women's empowerment. They're obviously preaching. It's kind of an outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood. They're preaching Islam and Islamic. So it's an Islamic charity organization, which in the early 1980s then gets funded and supported by the Israeli military.
Please repeat that one more time for everybody listening.
So the organization, before it was known as Hamas, it was known as the Islamic Collective, and it was funded and supported by the Israeli military in order to undermine what Israel perceived at the time to be its primary adversary, which was the PLO. Right, the PLO is this the Palestinian Liberation Organization based in exile, led by Yasser Arafat, carrying out attacks on Israeli targets, both in Israel and around the world. The Israelis embraced this divide and rule policy, which is sort of a classic colonial policy. The British embraced it almost everywhere they went. The Israelis embraced it in the 1980s and said, wow, in order for us to undermine the PLO, we're going to strengthen the Islamic Collective. Well, we all know how that turned out. So that's the organization in the 80s, and really, you could say that things start to change in late 1987, when after 20 years of Israeli military occupation, brutal military occupation, in which the Israeli army is killing 32 Palestinians every year for 20 years, in which the Israeli army is denying millions of Palestinians basic human rights, the right to vote for the government that controls their lives, the right to organize people for a political purpose, the right to paint a painting using green, black, red, and white, the right to wave a Palestinian flag, right? The right to use the word Palestine in the name of an organization. All of these things are being denied by the Israeli military. There's checkpoints, there's land confiscations. It's just daily brutality and humiliation for Palestinians for 20 years. And so guess what happens? They revolt. And that is the first intifada, the first uprising, in which from late 1987 until late 1988, the Israeli military enters Gaza, slaughters 142 Palestinians over the course of the year, and guess how many Israeli soldiers and Israeli civilians are killed in response, in return? 0. Because it's a non-violent uprising. It's basically Palestinian kids throwing stones at Israeli tanks, who slaughter them in the hundreds. And guess what happens as a result of mass murder of Palestinians? Well, they pick up arms and start to fight back. And that is when Hamas transitions from a charity organization to a militant resistance group. And so it starts to carry out attacks and then it embraces this charter, this infamous charter in 1988, calling for the establishment of an Islamic state in Palestine. and calling for violence against against Israeli targets. And from 1988 to 1994, carries out a few dozen attacks, mostly against Israeli military targets. And at every turn, when Hamas pursues more violence, it's almost always because of grotesque Israeli violence. This is when, so you could say, in the first instance, it was because of because of that grotesque violence used by the Israeli army during that first year in Gaza. That's when it first transitions to become a militant organization in the first place. And then it starts to attack civilians really only after the October 1990 slaughter of 21 Palestinians in Jerusalem. In October, you have these mass protests, and again, because the Israeli military occupation is brutal, Palestinians protest. 21 unarmed Palestinians are slaughtered in a protest in October, and then 2 months later, Hamas carries out its first major attack on an Israeli civilian target, killing 3 Israeli civilians in Jaffa in December 1990. And this is the pattern, right? Baruch Goldstein in 1994 enters the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron, slaughtering 29 Palestinian worshippers during Ramadan of all times, and this kind of leads to a reign of terror. And Hamas carries out a dozen or so attacks on Israeli civilians in the next few years. And then the same thing happens in the Second Intifada, when the Israeli military, during the first month, September 2000, Ariel Sharon takes a provocative tour on the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, asserting Israeli sovereignty, asserting Israeli control over the holiest site to Palestinians. Palestinians protest. During the first 3 weeks of those protests, the Israeli military slaughters 13 Palestinian children with gunshot wounds to the head. They're targeting their Palestinian kids in the head, and this ignites another round of Palestinian violence. And this is basically the pattern. And that's the story of Hamas. It's basically a response to Israeli grotesque violence from 1988 to the present. And here we are today, kind of living basically with the consequences of Israel's grotesque violence and Palestinian response to that violence.
Yep. So Hamas did not exist in 1901. It was a charity organization in the late 60s, and then became Hamas as we know it now in 87, 88, correct? Just to be very clear.
One of my favorite quotes is I believe it was the Zionist Organization of America is led by a guy, Mark, what's his name, Hoynen or something with an H. I forget his last name. He has this great quote where he says, "The origins of the BDS movement date to Hadrian's Hadrian, when he changed the name of Palestine, crushed the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 CE, and he replaced Judea with Palestine. That is the origins of BDS, right? There's this idea, there's this desire to sort of, paint this a picture of Jewish history of uninterrupted persecution from time immemorial to the present. Jews always have been and always will be persecuted. It's one of the laws of the universe. It's like there's gravity, there's mitochondrial DNA, and there's anti-Semitism, right? That's the narrative.
Yeah. So, as a historian, do you agree with the saying that history tends to repeat itself? And I ask you that because when I was going through some of your material, it sure sounded like we've seen this movie before, where conversations were happening as to how to transfer people from Gaza into other areas, how to get them, kind of get them out. Are we seeing this again, but just on a different level with AI?
The attempt to expel the Palestinian population of Gaza is already discussed in the early 1950s. In the 1956 Suez Crisis, when Israel joined Britain and France in a neo-colonial war to reoccupy the Suez Canal. Israel occupied Gaza for about 5 months, and there's discussions. The Israeli War Cabinet discusses how to expel Palestinian refugees from Gaza in 1956. And then when they reoccupy Gaza in 1967, they don't just discuss, they implement a plan to expel Palestinians from Gaza. So from 1967 to 1971, they expel hundreds. I mean, in 1968 alone, they convinced something like 70,000 Palestinians to leave Gaza. But basically, this is a policy that goes all the way to 1971, during which time Ariel Sharon in 1971 goes around Gaza, basically widening roads, building security zones, expelling another 15,000 Palestinians from Gaza to North Sinai. And then it's a policy that eventually it's much harder to implement expulsion during peacetime than it is wartime. Right? This is sort of one of the other laws of the universe. You can commit atrocities during wartime that you just can't commit during peacetime. You don't have cover fire. You don't have you don't have the fog of war, right? So it's just much harder. There'll be many more condemnations, and you'll face much more scrutiny than you would if you had done it during peacetime. So in any case, that policy, you could say, really comes to, let's say, a real slow point from 67. Really, I would say, from 71 to let's call it 93. You only get another something like a couple of thousand Palestinians over the course of that 20-year period or so are expelled. And there are always different reasons, right? But then, of course, already in the early 2000s, there's then more discussions of how do we get these Palestinians out of Gaza, and this proposal to push them to North Sinai resurfaces in the early 2000s. It resurfaces again in the 2010s, and then, of course, you could say the final solution doesn't really come until 2023 when the Israeli military, publishes this. What is it? A 15-20 page PDF file, a document by a think tank associated with the Israeli military, which lays out precisely the plan, which is we want to expel all 2.2 million Palestinians in Gaza to North Sinai. And that policy has been actually ongoing for the past 9 months. But actually, let me say one other thing. Even before that, there was a very quiet policy of pushing Palestinians out of Gaza from 2008 2007, 2008, all the way to the present, which was you close all the borders, you lock Palestinians in. That's the siege. And you deny them the right to have an economy. And so instead, they're leaving quietly, getting on boats, just like the Syrians, just like the Eritreans, and all the refugees and migrants from Africa and the Middle East and Central Asia have been doing for the past 10, 15 years, the migrant crisis, the immigration crisis in Europe, right? They've been doing that in Gaza as well, getting on boats, heading to Europe, heading to Greece, heading to Turkey, trying to brave the high seas for a better life abroad. And if you go to Gaza and ask people, they will all tell you they know someone who's gotten on a boat and left Gaza. And it's a very underreported story, but that had been happening for 15 years prior to October 7th. And then obviously we all know what the plan has been since October 7th. It's to expel everyone from Gaza to North Sinai. That's the plan with the pier, get Gazans on boats, maybe to Europe, maybe to Egypt, maybe elsewhere. It's basically ongoing. How many Palestinians have left Gaza since October 7th through the Rafah crossing? The estimates are hard to come by, but 30, 40,000 is probably a rough estimate. So this is an ongoing process, and it's been ongoing, I would say, from the 1950s all the way to the present day.
I'm shocked because I thought this whole thing started on October 7th of 2023. So thank you for making that clear that it was not the case. You write about extensively as well the experience in Gaza, where the borders are closed, they control their calorie intake, kidney failure is happening because of poor water conditions. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so when the Israeli military implemented a siege and a blockade on Gaza, you could say it was if you look at the entry and exit points at the border crossings, they really start to fall off a cliff already in 2005, after the quote unquote disengagement plan, when the Israeli military decided it was easier to control Gaza from the outside than from within. And so it pulled its troops out. It pulled out its 6,000 illegal settlers. And already in 2005, you see the number of Palestinian entry and exits to Gaza fall off a cliff, which continues to fall off a cliff in 2006 after Hamas wins the democratic elections. And then it really falls off. And then it goes from, whatever it was to basically zero in June 2007 when Hamas takes over power in Gaza. And since then, Israel has imposed a total siege on Gaza, which over the course of the past 16 years has had absolutely devastating consequences for all 2.2 million people living there, right? So we're talking, The hospital, the medical system is, deprived of electricity, right? They control how much electricity gets into Gaza. And they provide roughly, the estimates are, if you kind of average it out over the past 16 years, we're talking something like 50% of Gaza's electricity needs are met, which means you have 50% of, which means people can't turn on fans in the summertime. And you have people dying of heat strokes in the summer of 2022 because they don't have enough electricity to turn on a fan. Okay, you have 16 years of Palestinians prevented from getting medical care. You have, sewage water running through the streets because they can't filter the sewage because they don't have enough electricity. You have the caloric intake of the population controlled by the Israeli military. They count how many children are in Gaza. What is the average caloric need of a child? They count how many women are in Gaza. What is the average caloric need of a woman? They count how many men are in Gaza and calculate the average caloric need of an adult male. And that is how many calories they allow into Gaza. Right? So it's a total control. They don't want to kill Palestinians from starvation because they don't think the international community would allow them to do that. Turns out they were wrong about that. Yeah. But their belief at the time was they won't allow us to starve Gazans to death, so we have to put them on a diet. And those were the words of the then advisor to Israeli Prime Minister, was it Ehud Olmert, who said that we need to put them on a diet. And it's just you have 80% of households dependent on food aid, right? When you can't import anything, when you can't export anything, how do you have an economy? You don't, right? So there's 75% youth unemployment, 50% general unemployment. Everyone's dependent on food aid because there is no economy, there's no hope. And when there's no hope, and there's no hope for the future, you get October 7th.
Yeah. And just talking about Hamas, really just going back to them for a second. For the election, did I read correctly that Bush and George Bush II, George Bush, right? George W. Bush and Condoleezza Rice, they supported an open election. They were not happy with the result, and then they tried to sabotage the entire process thereafter, correct?
That's absolutely correct. And I think this is something that is generally underappreciated. In 2005, then U.S. President George W. Bush and then U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice are pushing the Palestinians to hold elections, right? This is, the United States' mission. Let's bring democracy to the Middle East, right? We all know how well that went in Iraq. And in Afghanistan, right? We're gonna bring democracy by force. We're gonna impose democracy through the use of armed force. And so they push Palestinians to hold elections. And at the time, at the election, the international elections observers call it the freest and fairest election in the entire Middle East, including Israel. And they hold this election. Palestinians, Hamas wins 44% of the Palestinian Legislative Council votes. Fatah wins 41%. But just the way the electoral votes work, Palestinians actually get a majority, 76 out of the 120 some odd seats. So they get a majority of the seats. And so they have a democratic mandate to rule. And so they start to basically take the reins of power. But what happens as a result of this victory is that Bush and Condoleezza Rice basically tell Mahmoud Abbas, whose party lost the election, they tell him, you have two options. You either form an emergency government, an emergency coalition that excludes Hamas, or we cut off funding. So your options are coup or die. Commit a coup, carry out a coup against a democratically elected Hamas, or we cut off funding and you're just going to die. So basically so Abbas does as he's told, as he long has done, as he's told, and forms this emergency government. Lo and behold, that leads to basically a civil war is how I would describe it between Fatah and Hamas fighters in Gaza. And this is basically ongoing, by the way, from January 2006 until June 2007. So for about 18 months, you get these skirmishes and you get these clashes, and it's a kind of a slow and gradual buildup. But eventually it boils over into an all-out civil war in Gaza in June 2007, during which Hamas wins and takes over power. But the narrative in the West is that it was Hamas that carried out a coup in June 2007. That narrative is false. It was Fatah that carried out the coup with the support of Israel and with the support of the United States. And so I think that is a very misunderstood story, at least if you ask the Western media pundits. who will tell you who will falsely tell you it was Fatah. It was Hamas that carried out the coup.
I don't know if you can answer this, but is it plausible that they knew Hamas was going to win and they knew sort of the next 10 steps after that of what they wanted to do to wreak havoc?
It's of course possible. Look, I think there's so much hubris on the part of the U.S. administration and the Israeli administration that there just was total lack of understanding and lack of awareness of just how unpopular their chosen president was and how their chosen political party was. And so I think hubris is probably the better explanation here. But it's obviously possible. I mean, there's all kinds of theories and conspiracy theories about many things, including that. But I wouldn't actually. I don't have any reason to believe that that it wasn't just hubris.
Yeah. And anything else about Gaza, just to educate our audience of how bad of a situation it's always been? I mean, obviously it's the worst it's ever been, but it's always been bad. Can you just shed a little bit more light or paint a different picture, if you will?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, in 1947, before the 1948 war, Gaza had about the entire Gaza Strip, which, by the way, didn't even exist as a concept, right? Before the war, there was no such thing as the Gaza Strip. There was Gaza City, there was Khan Yunis, there was Rafah, but there was no Gaza Strip. That was an Israeli invention. But basically, it had 70,000 inhabitants, the whole strip. And then after the 1948 war, the Israeli military forcibly expelled 200,000 Palestinians to the Gaza Strip. So, it 4x's the population of the strip, such that 2/3 to 3/4 of the population is now refugees. And if you read the reports already in the aftermath of that war, they sound eerily similar to the reports you read now. I mean, total impoverishment, overcrowding in refugee camps, lack of access to clean water, just these 40 children in a tent, learning from one chalkboard and one piece of chalk, right? There's just the reports you read in the conditions in the refugee camps in the 1950s are eerily reminiscent of the reports you're reading today. And really, you could say at any period in time from 1948 to the present, you will read some journalist, some reporter going into Gaza saying it's a hellhole. It's just an absolute shit show because there's no investment in Gaza. The Egyptians neglect it. They impose martial law on the Gaza Strip for 15 years. The Israelis take it over. They continue their policies of home demolitions and expulsions, and those policies continue more or less in an ongoing fashion all the way to the present day. And then obviously you get the siege, and first you get the lockdowns beginning in 1990. So just to briefly tell this story. For 20 years, from 1967 until actually 1990, so about 24 years, the Israeli military, the Israeli government encourages Palestinians in Gaza to work in Israel. They're cheap labor, and there's this belief that that this will actually benefit the Israeli economy. And there's also an attempt to undermine the Gazan economy by preventing them from establishing their own businesses and preventing them from establishing a self-sustaining economic base. Israel wants the Palestinians dependent on Israel for work. And so by 1990, 40% of Gazans are working in Israel. And then in 1990, Israel takes away that permit and says you need to apply for a permit instead of getting one granted automatically. And so overnight, Israel threatens the livelihood of 40% of the people of Gaza. And so then over the course of the 1990s, you get crisis after crisis after crisis when Israel imposes lockdowns on the Gaza Strip. And so in 1996, you have a 70% unemployment rate in Gaza when Israel imposes these lockdowns. And the World Food Program spins up an emergency operation to supply food aid to Palestinians going hungry in Gaza in 1996. And those policies continue. Israel imposes more lockdowns in the 2000s, and then the World Food Program implements more emergency food operations in 2002 and 2003. And then, of course, we all know what happened after 2006, 2007. We just talked about that. So this has been an ongoing crisis for 75 years.
And am I correct in saying that Hamas actually has tried to create peace? Was it over 5 times and was rejected by Israel 5 times? Is that correct?
Yeah, there's a peace proposal in June 1988 before they adopt the infamous charter. You have Mahmoud al-Zahar, Hamas's third in command, goes to Tel Aviv, and he meets with then Israeli Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin, presents to him a peace proposal that's rejected. And then, throughout the early 2000s and 2001, 2, and 3, you have these peace proposals from Hamas, basically saying, look, we essentially agree to the internationally accepted framework for resolving the Israel-Palestine dispute, where they're basically talking about a 10-year truce. If you withdraw from the occupied Palestinian territories, if you grant us a capital in East Jerusalem, and agree to a just resolution to the refugee issue, we're open to peace. Again, always these peace proposals always fall on deaf ears. Israel had never had any intention of actually withdrawing from the territories, actually giving Palestinians real sovereignty, actually giving Palestinians control in East Jerusalem, actually resolving the refugee issue. There's never any serious attempt to resolve those issues. And then you get Palestinian Hamas leaders publishing op-eds in The Guardian. Ismail Haniyeh publishes an op-ed in The Guardian saying more or less that exact same thing, that peace proposal in 2006. Khalid Mash'al says the same thing in 2007. These proposals are all rejected. In 2012, you have Hamas, basically these backdoor negotiations between Hamas and the Israeli military. They essentially come to an agreement. This draft of an agreement is then handed over to Hamas's third in command at the time, or Hamas's second in command at the time. His name is escaping me at the moment. That Hamas military commander receives a draft agreement in 2012. He's expected to sign it. 3 hours later, Israel assassinates him. That triggers the 2012 war. But this is an ongoing, basically it's the same story over and over and over again. It's Hamas, which is the problem for Israel is that it knows that it has to actually make real concessions with Hamas. Because Hamas will not accept, as you can see right now, Hamas is not playing games. They're very clear. I mean, it's remarkable how clear they are and how clear they have been. Like, these are our demands. If you agree to a permanent ceasefire, if you release a large number of Palestinian prisoners, and if you completely withdraw the Israeli military from Gaza, we're open to a ceasefire agreement. Right, that has been on the table for months now, but it's continuously rejected by Israel. So here we are again. You can add another kind of Israel rejection to this list of Israeli rejections, which is the current rejection, which is Hamas is open to peace and Israel's not.
And I know it's not exactly the same. If you go back to, I think it was 1967, where Hamas was a charity organization that was supported by the Israeli government, to an extent, is there some symmetry here where the Israeli government was actually still supporting Hamas, ensuring that they were receiving funding because they wanted to invoke this divide and conquer strategy between the two different governments in Palestine, correct?
It's exactly right. It's in fact, it's the exact same policy they then later pursued in the 2000s and 2010s and 2020s, right? It was, back then, we're going to support the Islamic Collective, which became Hamas, to undermine the PLO. Now we're going to support Fatah. We're going to drive a wedge between Fatah and Hamas. In fact, we're going to support Hamas to undermine Fatah, and we're so different parties, but same general approach.
Yeah, and talk about October 7th a little bit. And two things come to mind: the Hannibal Directive and the false accusations of rapes. Can you talk about those two components?
Yeah, so the Hannibal Directive it's an order that the Israeli military issued on October 7th, and this is no longer even debated. For a while, it was contested, but now it's not really up for debate anymore. We have multiple Israeli military officials who have admitted to having essentially issued this Hannibal Directive, which is an order that the Israeli military issues to prevent its civilians or its soldiers from being kidnapped, from being held captive, which is that we would rather, we will use all means necessary, which is a way of saying we're willing to kill our own soldiers and civilians in order to prevent them from being taken hostage or from being taken captive, so that we then don't have to release all these Palestinian prisoners, so that Hamas has no leverage. And that order was issued on October 7th in multiple places. So we know it was issued. Israeli helicopters fired. They fired on the rave. They fired. You have in Kibbutz Be'eri. They fired a tank. A tank fired on a home that was basically in which there were Palestinian militants as well as Israeli civilians. So they used this. They issued this directive in multiple locations on October 7th in order to prevent their own soldiers and their own civilians from being taken by Hamas. The exact number of Israeli civilians killed by the Israeli military is unknown. The estimates I've seen are a few dozen. Maybe it was a few hundred. We honestly don't know the answer, because Israel doesn't want a proper investigation to come out. Right? They're very afraid that, I mean, they've in January there was a UN delegation that was sent to Israel to basically carry out a comprehensive a report on what happened on October 7th. Israel rejected that delegation, because it doesn't want its own civilians to know that it issued this directive. Now, with regard to the false allegations of mass rape, basically, the way I would tell this story was that in the first few days after October 7th, right, there was this outpouring of support for Israel, right? They had just experienced their own 9/11. That was the terminology that was being used at the time in the United States, at least. And there was this outpouring of support. But within, a few days or a week or two, it became obvious to people paying close attention to the situation, that the narrative had flipped already. It didn't take long. I mean, it was already less than a week after October 7th, the Israeli military had already killed more Palestinians than Palestinians had killed on October 7th, and it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And so the narrative was turning against Israel. And by late November, December, it was very clear that the world was now talking about what was happening in Gaza already as a genocide, because you had already had all the statements from all the Israeli leaders, all these genocidal statements, and it was clear they were carrying out all these grotesque massacres day after day after day. And so Israel needed a new narrative to rally the troops, to convince the world that Israel's military campaign in Gaza was just. And so what did it do? It went on a media blitz, and it put out all of the, and basically, put out all of these reports to journalists, with evidence that there were these mass rapes on October 7th. And it convinced the Physicians for Human Rights in Israel to publish a report that it later retracted, that there was mass rape. So it got basically these human rights organizations to even publish the propaganda. But what we've learned since is that it was exactly that, basically a propaganda blitz. There's no forensic evidence. There's no victims. It's not really clear anyone was raped at all on October 7th. What we have are testimony from Zachary volunteers. These are men who have been who spread the most insidious lies from October 7th, who spread the 40 beheaded babies lie, who spread the babies in the ovens lie, who spread the fetus pulled from a pregnant woman's lie. They spread these lies. These were the sources. They also spread them, and so the Zachary volunteers claiming there were these rapes. Then you had was it Raz Cohen, who changed his story 3 or 4 times and then was cited in the New York Times as saying he witnessed the mass rapes. So he had all these, basically all of the testimonies, all of the reports that apparently documented the rape, all proved to be false. There were no photos. The Times of London, they published a report a few weeks ago where they themselves went through all the video footage, thousands of hours of video footage from the Hamas, GoPros, thousands and tens of thousands of photos. They couldn't find evidence of a single case of rape, a single case of sexual violence. Right, so there's just no evidence that even a single rape occurred, let alone mass rape, let alone Hamas mass rape, let alone Hamas mass rape as a weapon of war. So it's layers and layers and layers of misinformation and propaganda, all used for a single purpose: to manufacture consent for a genocide. And we know this is the most visceral form of manufactured consent because it's been used over and over and over again throughout colonial history. And by the way, in the United States, from the 1880s to 1940s, you know the most common excuse that was provided for a lynching? It was not murder, it was not theft, it was rape. It was weird. You black man, you raped a white woman, we're gonna lynch you. And this is the case throughout all of colonial history. If there's been a great deal written about this, which is the way to commit colonial violence, the way to justify mass murder, the way to rile people up, is to tell them that the colonized peoples are raping our women. That is what will get them to agree to genocide, and that's what the Israelis have done since October 7th.
And we keep falling for it. That's what's crazy. We continue to fall for it to an extent, even with social media.
and gets repeated. You have U.S. politicians. You have U.S. politicians repeating this on CNN, and it goes unchallenged. And the New York Times December 26th article, Screams Without Words, it remains on the website. It has not been retracted, even though every single eyewitness testimony, including the family of the chief victim in that story, even her own family says we were manipulated. Our daughter was not raped. Roz Cohen's testimony was discredited. The Zakat volunteers were discredited. Every single piece of evidence in that report was discredited. The Times' own podcast refused to publish the podcast version of that article because of the shaky evidence. And yet the story remains up. The paper of record printing misinformation.
Yeah. And my knowledge base around South Africa is not that great, and maybe you can help me here a little bit. But there's always this comparison with what happened with apartheid in South Africa to what's happening in Palestine right now. And obviously, we all have hope this is going to change. We're gonna make it through, and we will be free again. However, am I wrong in saying the only difference in the case of South Africa was there wasn't this religious cloud hanging over it? In the situation with Palestine, it's very clear, specifically with the Christian Zionists, that there's a religious cloud hanging over us. So it may be a little bit different, right?
Look, there are obviously many differences between South Africa and Israel-Palestine. That's certainly one of them. I think that may help explain why it is that Israel, despite its apartheid regime, manages to garner so much international support. Right? South Africa didn't have these eschatological fantasies around Jews moving to Israel-Palestine at the end of days. They didn't have that going for them. Right? But Israel does have that going for it. It does have Christian evangelicals in the United States claiming that, Israel is necessary for the end of days. So that's a big difference. I mean, there are obviously other differences, but I think the key point here with regard to the apartheid accusation is that apartheid is a legal term defined by international law and the Rome Statute. Right? It's not. I mean, it was abstracted away from the South African case of apartheid, and this is how international law comes about, right? This is how crimes against humanity come about. It's you have a crime in one place. In this case, it was apartheid South Africa, but then it's basically abstracted away. International legal experts say, "Look, this is something that can happen in many other places around the world, and in fact is happening in many other places around the world. Let's abstract away the particulars of South Africa and establish a legal term." And establish a legal concept. Let's define it. And there's a 2-sentence definition. It's very clear. It's very straightforward, right? It's a systematic. It's a regime that uses crimes against humanity to maintain the systematic domination of one racial group over another. That's the basic definition. And we see that happening in Israel-Palestine. So regardless of the differences, of which there were obviously many, it's quite obvious that every human rights organization has arrived at the same conclusion. Israel is an apartheid state, right? It's practicing apartheid. I mean, that is no longer controversial.
But in South Africa, there was not I could be wrong here, but there wasn't a religious undertone whatsoever. Is that correct?
I think you're right. Yeah, no, I think you're correct about that. Yeah.
Okay, got it. So quickly, 1-state or 2-state solution? What's your take here? I say quickly, sort of tongue in cheek.
Yeah, fair point. I mean, look, the 2-state solution, even that phrase, 2-state solution, is a problematic phrase because there's a 1-state reality. I mean, we can talk about however many states we want in the future, but there is one state between the river and the sea. That is the state of Israel. It has one prime minister. It has one cabinet. It has a single legislative body. That's the Knesset. It has a single military. It has a single chain of command. And that single prime minister, that single cabinet, that single Knesset, that single chain of command controls everything. There's not like a separate government that is in charge of the West Bank and Gaza, right? It's all one thing.
Yep.
And that's why it's an apartheid state. Because within that state, there's 3.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank who do not have the right to vote for the government that controls their lives. They don't have freedom of movement. They lack basic property rights. They don't have the right to the water that sits under them. They don't have the right to the airspace above them, even though they're under the control of the Israeli government. So it's plain and simple apartheid. Sorry, the question was one state or two state.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's
So there is one state. There probably always will be one state
Yeah.
because the Israeli, no past Israeli government or any present Israeli government or quite likely any future Israeli government will ever give Palestinians real control, real sovereignty, real autonomy. And unless you give Palestinians real sovereignty and real control, they're not going to accept a kind of Bantu stand. They're not going to accept these cantonized, pseudo-autonomous, subject to Israeli military control. They're not going to accept that. And if you don't accept that, then we're living in a one-state reality. We will continue to live in a one-state reality. And I think the only solution to that one-state reality is equality, where it doesn't matter what your religion is, it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is, that you all have the same rights. And I know that's such a radical concept, and I'm extremist for saying that, right? But that's the obvious solution. Equality, I know, crazy.
absolutely crazy. And it worked in the past before, right?
Well, look, it works inside Israel to a certain, inside Israel proper, right? There's 1.8 million Palestinians in Israel, right? It kind of works. I'm not saying they're not discriminated against. No, they are discriminated against. They're second-class citizens, just like you have second-class citizens in American democracy, and you have second-class citizens in German democracy, and you have second-class citizens in every democracy. Israeli democracy also has second-class citizens, but it kind of works. You don't have Palestinian Israelis blowing themselves up in cafes, right? When it turns out when you give people the right to vote, when you treat them, you give them most rights, not all rights, you give them a lot of rights. They don't want to blow you up. They actually just want to participate in the democracy, and they want to live a good life, and they want to buy a house and send their kids to good schools, just like all people in all the parts of the world want.
Yeah. So just a few more questions. I have a lot of individuals that are relatively young, college students, or some are early in the workforce, who grew up in Zionist families, and they reach out all the time. And some of them have been my students, to be honest, as well. And, there's something not right here. Point me in the right direction. What should I be doing? What advice do you have for those individuals that are really going through this sort of dissonance within themselves?
I would say, first of all, educate yourself. Read. There's so much incredible content these days, so many podcasts, including yours, including dozens and dozens of other podcasts. You don't even have to read anything. You just have to listen, on your morning jog, on your morning commute. Just pop open pop some earbuds in, listen to some great pods, educate yourself. That's number one, because if you are educated, that's empowerment. You have the ability to understand things other people don't. You have the ability to debunk myths. You can be a more effective human rights advocate. So I would say, first of all, educate yourself. That's number one. And then go do activism the way you want to do it, whether that's boycotting brands you oppose and supporting brands you support, whether that's getting out on the streets and waving signs and chanting slogans, whether that's lobbying your elected officials, whether that's in your company, whether that's getting your company or your university to boycott companies that are supporting Israeli genocide, right? So whatever it is that you want to do, there's no right or wrong form of activism. There's a million and one ways to be an activist, and I would encourage everyone to do the form of activism, the type of activism that resonates with you.
Yeah, many of them are just afraid of their parents as well. How are their parents going to react? Because their parents are obviously staunch Zionist, and kind of how to navigate that conversation as well, I think has been a bit tricky for them.
Look, I'm the wrong person to ask about that, because I haven't figured that one out either. So it's tough. It's really tough. Yeah. It's not easy. If you have a good idea, please do let me know.
I don't know. No, I'm here to learn. So you talk about educating. So let's talk about Palestine Nexus for a moment here. And I would like to make a deal with you. The first 10 people that email you that they want to take the course will cover the cost. The podcast will cover the cost of 10 courses. So 10 different people. So would that work for you?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. And how can they reach out to you?
Yeah, so you can reach us at PalestineNexus@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter, _Zach Foster, ZACH Foster. I'm on Instagram, Zachary _Foster __. I should have the same handle across platforms, but I don't. So what can you do? But yeah, you can find us our website, PalestineNexus.com. You've got a an about page where you can submit a form there. There's lots of ways to find us. We would be very happy to offer those people who reach out the course. Let us know. We'd love to have you.
And that's where they can sign up for Palestine in your inbox as well, correct?
That's right. Yeah. PalestineNexus.com. Just put your email in. You'll get the newsletter every week. Would love to have you as a subscriber.
Anything you're working on that you want to share? You have any upcoming books or another dissertation you're going to burn or anything like that?
Well, I do. So I'm working on another course. It's a bit early now to reveal the exact title of that course, but it's going to be, the course that I taught is basically a kind of a 101 1870 to the present, right? Divided into 4 lectures. I want to zoom now in on we're still working out the exact contours of the course, but it'll be a much more in-depth course on a smaller piece of the history.
And you're going to work on a third project possibly for the workforce too, like you promised us at the beginning, right?
That's exactly right.
Zachary, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I really did enjoy this conversation and doing the research and listening to all of your YouTube videos and reading all of your material. Very informative. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumúd. All about humanity, so this right here for everyone. Uplift, amplify, empower everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumúd. Listen, stay tuned, cause it's time for Sumúd.